Richard is out in the field with the fleet. An actual deployment, you know. Not just clocking into some tedious administrative office like you do. No offense, of course. That was how my younger sister Chloe completely trashed 15 years of my blood, sweat, and classified operations just to prop up her shiny Admiral's wife label right in the middle of a family birthday dinner. My parents stared down at their plates, their silence a spineless endorsement. My invisibility was the exact fuel her narcissistic ego needed to survive. My chest tightened. I didn't scream. I just looked her dead in the eye and let the silence hang. Because she had absolutely no idea. No idea that her hollow arrogance would shatter into a million pieces when her precious Admiral husband turns pale, locks his knees, and stands at attention for me in a top-secret Pentagon briefing room in exactly 2 weeks. Before I tell you how that went down, take a second to hit like and subscribe. But only do it if this hits close to home. Drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there right now? The insult hung over the dining table, thick and suffocating. Nobody blinked. Nobody stepped in. My dad cleared his throat, reaching for a Coors Light. Pop! The metallic snap of the tab echoed off the cheap drywall. He took a long pull, keeping his eyes glued to the TV playing softly in the background. Anything to avoid the crossfire. My mom. She went straight into damage control mode, not by defending me, but by burying the tension under a mountain of artificial sugar. She drove a heavy silver fork into a massive slice of store-bought buttercream cake and slid it across the table toward Chloe. "Oh, honey, try this." Mom cooed, her voice practically dripping with forced cheer. "And I just love that nail polish on you." Is that new? Deflection? The ultimate suburban survival tactic. They used cheap sugar and fake compliments to grease the wheels of my humiliation. It was easier to let me bleed out quietly than to deal with one of Chloe's tantrums. I didn't say a word. I set my fork down on the ceramic plate, clink. Slowly, I lowered my hands to my lap. Underneath the table, hidden by the cheap lace tablecloth, I clenched my fists. I squeezed my fingers together until the knuckles cracked a sharp, ugly sound that got drowned out by Mom chewing loudly on cake. Chloe shifted in her seat, acting like she owned the damn room. She reached for her oversized Prada bag, scanning the cluttered chairs for an empty spot. Finding none, her eyes landed on the chair next to her, where I had draped my faded, olive-drab field jacket. She scrunched up her nose like she just smelled spoiled milk. Without missing a beat, she grabbed the collar of my jacket and shoved it aside, half dumping it onto the floor to make room for her leather purse. "Move this work stuff, Alicia," Chloe muttered casually, swatting the fabric away. "The zipper's gonna scratch my calfskin." She wiped her hands together, disgusted. My jaw locked. She saw a dirty piece of work stuff. She didn't know that 3 years ago, outside a crumbling compound in Kandahar, I used that exact jacket to wrap the shredded torso of a 19-year-old kid. He bled out, waiting for a medevac. The fabric still had faint rust-colored stains baked into the lining that no industrial bleach could ever strip away. I looked at the shiny, flawless surface of her Prada bag. Then I slowly dragged my eyes up to meet hers. Empty, shallow, a void wrapped in expensive cashmere. I didn't reach for the jacket. I didn't adjust my chair. I planted my boots on the hardwood floor and stood up. My posture shifted on instinct, spine straight, shoulders squared. The room instantly felt smaller. I looked down at her. I kept my voice flat, zero inflection, zero emotion. "What if you're wrong, Chloe?" I asked, the words slicing through the room's stale air. "What if your assumptions are completely off?" Chloe let out a loud, theatrical sigh and rolled her eyes hard. She lifted her left hand, twisting her oversized diamond engagement ring into the light. "Oh, please, drop the mysterious act, Alicia," she scoffed, leaning back and crossing her arms. "We all know how the Navy works. Someone's got to do the coffee runs and file the paperwork so my husband's fleet can actually operate. Just own it." There it was. A concrete wall of pure ignorance. Her mind was locked shut, cemented by her own arrogance. You don't waste live ammo on a reinforced bunker. You bypass it. I reached down, grabbed the collar of my field jacket, and slung it over my shoulder. I didn't look at my dad, who was suddenly very interested in the label on his beer bottle. I didn't look at Chloe. I just turned and walked toward the entryway. Alicia, wait! We haven't even done the presents yet. Mom called out, her voice shaky, laced with that fake, desperate guilt. I didn't answer. I hit the deadbolt, pushed the heavy oak door open, and stepped out. The brutal November Virginia wind hit my face like a slap, sucking the smell of that sickeningly sweet buttercream right out of my lungs. I kept my stride, even boots crunching on the frozen driveway gravel. I pulled open the rusted door of my truck and climbed inside, slamming it shut behind me. The heavy thud cut off the world outside. I hit the lock button. Safe space. I took a breath, reaching for the ignition. Before my fingers grazed the keys, a sharp vibration hammered against my ribs. I paused. I reached into the left breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out the encrypted black phone. The screen was dark, but it buzzed twice in rapid succession. Buzz, buzz, no caller ID, no text preview. Just a single glowing red dot in the center of the glass. A Tier 1 priority summons. The ghost was being called back to the shadows. I threw my keys onto the bare granite counter. The metal clattered against the cold stone, a harsh crack in a dead silent room. My apartment didn't look like a home. No framed family photos on the walls. No soft rugs. No decorative garbage. It was a sterile concrete box. The brutal, unforgiving order of a state-sponsored ghost. I peeled off my civilian shirt, tossing it onto a stool. I caught my reflection in the dark kitchen window. A jagged, ugly map of raised scar tissue crawled across my left shoulder. I ran my fingers over the pale, dead skin. A parting gift from a downed Black Hawk in a dust storm. My sister had nearly thrown a tantrum over a potential scratch on a calfskin purse an hour ago. I carried a 1/4-inch deep crater in my collarbone. 2 different worlds. 2 different realities. And my family had chosen to live in the fake one. I walked barefoot into the bedroom, the chill of the hardwoods seeping into my soles. I pushed aside a blank canvas leaning against the closet wall, exposing a heavy steel wall safe. I gripped the cold metal dial. 3 turns right, 2 left, 1 right. The heavy internal bolt gave a solid, satisfying clunk. I reached past a stack of spare Glock magazines, past the encrypted hard drives. My fingers scraped the very bottom of the steel box and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. The edges were yellowed, stiff. A bank statement, 7 years old. I unfolded it under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of the room. Looking at the faded black numbers, the sterile smell of my apartment vanished. Suddenly my lungs were burning with the stench of cordite burning diesel and fine desert sand. That number on the paper wasn't just digits, it was hazard pay. Blood money. Earned by kicking in splintered doors in the middle of the night, waiting for a tripwire to blow my legs off. 7 years ago, Dad gambled his way into a massive hole. The bank sent the final foreclosure notice. They were going to take the house, the very same house I had just walked out of tonight. So I starved my own savings account. I lived off cold combat rations in a rat-infested forward operating base. I wired every single dime of my combat pay back to Virginia to keep a roof over their heads. But the mortgage company didn't get all of it. I stared at the paper, and the memory of that satellite phone call rushed back loud and clear. The static, the distant boom of artillery outside my tent, and Mom's voice on the line dripping with fake defensive sweetness. "Alicia, honey," she had cooed over the static. "You have to understand, Chloe has that big Navy ball coming up. Richard's commanding officers will be there. She needed to look the part." I took a few grand from the transfer for a silk dress and some decent shoes, so your sister could hold her head up high. I was biting down on a leather strap while a medic dug steel out of my leg when she said that. I was bleeding through a crude bandage, and she was justifying stealing my combat pay for a designer dress. "You're just sitting safe in an administrative office anyway," she had added, rushing to shut down any argument. "It's not like you are in harm's way. You don't need the extra cash right now. Be a good big sister." That was the lie. That was the brainwashing. Standing in the cold light of my bedroom, I finally understood the sheer depth of their delusion. They didn't just steal my money. They robbed me of my reality. They convinced themselves I was a useless paper-pushing freeloader sitting behind a desk. Why? Because if they acknowledged the truth that I was dodging bullets to pay for their suburban lifestyle, the guilt would have crushed them. It was a survival mechanism for their own egos, a masterclass in gaslighting. It was easier to turn me into a parasite. If I was just a boring secretary, they didn't have to feel guilty about bleeding me dry. They swallowed their own poison so they could sleep at night. Have you ever bled yourself dry to save your family only for them to treat you like a free ATM? If you know the bitter, suffocating reality of being financially exploited by the people who are supposed to protect you, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below and type the word enough if you have ever had to cut a toxic family member off because of money. You are not alone, and your anger is absolutely justified. I held the 7-year-old bank statement. I didn't cry. Crying is for people who still have hope. My hands didn't shake. The anger I felt wasn't a hot, explosive rage. It was a cold, calculated freeze, ice in the veins. The last pathetic thread of family loyalty snapped. I walked over to the heavy-duty cross-cut shredder in the corner of the room. I flicked the power switch. The motor growled hungry and loud. I fed the stiff paper into the steel teeth. It screeched as the blades ripped the lie into tiny, unrecognizable strips. I watched the numbers get chewed into dust. The pity was dead. The mercy was gone. I turned back to the safe. I reached past the guns and pulled out a heavy rubberized military laptop. I set it on the desk. No passwords to type. No standard login. I pressed my right thumb flat against the biometric glass scanner below the keyboard. A red laser swept over my skin, reading the ridges. The cooling fans kicked into overdrive, a low mechanical whine. The dark screen flickered once, then flooded my face with a harsh neon green light. Block letters marched across the center of the monitor. Authentication accepted. Clearance level 5. Welcome back, Phantom 6. 5 in the morning. The Virginia air outside was a bitter, freezing slap, but inside the E-ring of the Pentagon, it was just sterile. Dead recycled air, the faint smell of industrial floor cleaner, and cold, polished marble. I walked down the long, empty corridor. My boots hit the floor in a steady, heavy rhythm. Clack, 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 echoing off the walls like a hammer. 3 separate security checkpoints, metal detectors that buzzed with a low, angry hum. Retinal scanners that shot a blinding red laser into my eye. Thick bulletproof glass that separated the watchers from the watched. I didn't say a word to the guards. I didn't offer a polite morning nod. I just held up the thick plastic lanyard hanging around my neck. The red barcode stripe on my ID caught the harsh overhead light. The 2 heavily armored guards at the final reinforced steel door didn't ask me for a coffee order. They didn't care about designer labels, neighborhood gossip, or fake suburban smiles. They saw the red stripe. They snapped their heavy boots together, the sound cracking like a whip. They shifted their automatic rifles across their tactical vests and offered a crisp, silent salute. Right there, outside that heavy vault door, the boring office clerk my family loved to mock died on the cold linoleum floor. Out in the driveway, I was Alicia the Disappointment. In here, I was the Reaper. I grabbed the steel handle and stepped into the SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. Absolute soundproofing. 2 feet of concrete and copper shielding. No cell signals, no outside world. Just the low grating hum of heavy-duty cooling servers and the bitter acidic smell of cheap, burnt black coffee sitting in a stained glass pot. I dropped into the worn leather chair at the center console. It squeaked under my weight. 4 massive radar monitors glowed neon green and stark white in the dim, windowless room. The mission brief was already blinking on the far left screen. An offshore terrorist splinter cell moving heavy surface-to-air munitions under the cover of a coastal storm. My job was to dissect their air defense grid, to find the blind spots in the static. Every string of numbers I punched into this terminal dictated who came home in a flag-draped coffin and who got to drink a cold beer on a porch again. I leaned forward. My eyes burned, tracking the thermal heat signatures crawling across the digital topographical map. Focus. Pure, ice-cold focus. My brain flipped the survival switch. I took the memory of that sickening buttercream cake, the pop of my dad's beer can, and Chloe's arrogant, empty eye rolling, and shoved it all into a dark, locked box in the back of my mind. That suburban garbage had no place in this bunker. Out here, arrogance got people killed in the dirt. I was 40 minutes into running the geospatial algorithms when it hit. A sharp, violent cramp ripped through my left shoulder blade. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, catching on a dry gasp. It was a nasty parting gift from the Black Hawk crash a year ago. The surgeons had dug jagged shrapnel out of my muscle, but the deadened nerves still had a mind of their own. They fired off random blinding spikes of agony when I pushed myself too hard. I didn't groan. I didn't ask the junior tech across the room for a break. I pushed the heavy chair back, the casters grinding against the floor, and walked fast down the narrow hall to the private washroom. I pushed the door shut and slapped the deadbolt into place. The room was freezing. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps, casting pale, sick shadows on the mirror. I unbuttoned the top of my uniform with stiff fingers and pulled the heavy fabric down, exposing the thick white gauze taped over my collarbone. Fresh blood had seeped through. Small angry red spots staining the sterile white mesh. 24 hours ago, my little sister was ready to throw a fit because the metal zipper of my jacket brushed against her precious calfskin purse. Right now, my own skin was tearing open, and I didn't have the luxury to complain. I didn't have time to bleed. I grabbed the edge of the porcelain sink with my right hand. My knuckles turned bone white. I bit down on my bottom lip. Hard enough to taste hot copper. I reached up with my good hand and ripped the soiled medical dressing off in one fast, brutal motion. Fire shot down my spine. The torn skin burned like someone had pressed a lit cigarette to my collarbone. I didn't look up at the mirror. I didn't want to see the exhaustion hollowed out in my own eyes. I grabbed a fresh roll of medical tape and a clean, thick cotton pad from the red wall kit. I clamped the pad over the bleeding wound and pulled the tape tight across my chest. I pulled it so hard my arm shook. The muscle spasms fought against the pressure vibrating under my skin, but I forced the tape down. Seal it. Hide it. Keep moving. I grabbed a rough paper towel, scrubbed a smudge of wet blood off my neck, and threw it in the metal trash can. I buttoned my shirt all the way up to the collar to hide the blood. I smoothed out the fabric. Perfect. Extreme, unyielding discipline. Nobody gets to see the commander bleed. Not here, not ever. I unlocked the bathroom door and walked back into the freezing SCIF. The digital tactical clock on the wall was ticking down, the red numbers flashing. The Navy strike team was getting into position. They were flying blind in the dark water, waiting for my signal to drop the hammer. I sat back down in the leather chair. I rested my hands on the cold plastic of the keyboard. The joint in my left shoulder throbbed with a sickening heavy pulse. Every single heartbeat sent a fresh spike of pain shooting down to my fingertips. My hands didn't shake. They hovered over the keys, rock solid. I didn't think about my mother's fake, placating smile. I didn't think about my father staring at his beer to avoid conflict. I didn't think about Chloe's diamond ring or her pathetic need to feel superior. They were small, weak people living in a fragile, insulated bubble. I stared at the grid. I found the gap in the radar, the single tiny blind spot in the storm. I typed the final 12 digits of the strike coordinates. The keys clacked loudly in the silent room. My index finger hovered over the heavy enter key for a fraction of a second. This was my world, a brutal, unforgiving fortress of steel, blood, and consequence. And it was a wall my family would never ever have the right to breach. I pressed the key. Target locked. The heavy steel door to the SCIF groaned open. The sharp, acrid smell of burnt, cheap cigar tobacco immediately cut through the sterile, filtered air of the room. I didn't need to look up from the glowing thermal grid. Colonel Hayes. The junior techs around me scrambled. Chairs scraped violently against the linoleum. Boots slammed together. Salutes snapped. Hayes waved a thick, calloused hand, dismissing them before he even fully entered the room. He didn't care about the pageantry. He cared about results. He walked straight to my console. His boots were scuffed, the leather worn down from actual dirt and motor pool oil, not polished for a country club dinner. He leaned over the glass barrier, his eyes scanning the red and green markers I had just locked in. The smell of old tobacco and black coffee radiated off his uniform. Sharp arc analysis, Phantom 6, Hayes said. His voice was gravel and smoke. Without you mapping this grid, those Navy boys are flying completely blind over the water. You keep them alive. Good work. He didn't hand out gold stars. He didn't offer empty praise. He looked at the board, saw the math, saw the dead bodies I just prevented, and gave a firm nod. He measured my worth in blood saved and assets secured. Back in Virginia, my family measured my worth by the brand of leather sitting on a dining chair. Hayes walked away. I kept my eyes on the screen, forcing the tension out of my jaw. A sudden slide of cardboard against glass broke my focus. A tall paper cup stopped exactly 2 inches from my right hand. Steam curled from the plastic lid. Black coffee, scalding hot. No sugar. Exactly the way I needed it to stay sharp. I tilted my head up. Liam. He stood on the other side of the console. Marine. He had a faded, jagged scar cutting across his jawline and ash-gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He stood at ease, arms crossed, leaning his weight against the edge of the desk. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how my weekend was. He just looked at me. It was a heavy, grounded look. Total unspoken understanding. I reached for the coffee cup with my left hand. It was a mistake. A sharp electric spike of pain flared under the fresh bandages on my collarbone. My neck muscles seized. It was a microscopic reaction, a fraction of a flinch. I suppressed it instantly, biting the inside of my cheek, and kept my hand moving toward the cup. But Liam's eyes narrowed. He saw it. He didn't make a scene. He didn't offer loud, noisy pity or ask me if I was hurt. Pity is useless. He uncrossed his arms, walked around the back of my chair, and planted his hands on the heavy base of my dual radar monitors. With a slow, deliberate scrape, he pulled the entire rig exactly 2 inches closer to the edge of the desk. 2 inches. It was all I needed so I wouldn't have to extend my torn left shoulder to type. My chest tightened, not from the physical pain, from the bitter, crushing contrast. My own mother had lived in the same house as me for 38 years. She watched me drag my feet through the hallway with a sprained ankle in high school and told me to walk faster so we wouldn't be late for church. She never noticed a damn thing unless it inconvenienced her. This man. He watched the tension in my jaw for half a second and silently rebuilt my workspace so I wouldn't bleed. Drink. Liam muttered, his voice a low rumble. He stepped back. I wrapped my fingers around the hot paper cup. The heat seeped into my skin, chasing away the Pentagon chill. I took a sip. It burned the roof of my mouth, bitter and strong. Perfect. 2 hours later, shift rotation. I stood by the water cooler in the dim breakaway hall. The fluorescent light above flickered, buzzing with a dying hum. I stared at the cheap plastic cup in my hand, watching the water ripple with the vibration of the building's massive HVAC system. Heavy footsteps approached. Liam stopped next to me. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead on the blank concrete wall. He unscrewed the cap of his battered metal thermos and took a sip. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was a shield. Whatever that crowd said to you last night, Liam said, his voice dropping an octave, flat and hard. Remember who is actually controlling the board in this room. I swallowed hard. The lump in my throat felt like a swallowed stone. I didn't tell him what happened at the dinner. I didn't tell him about the Prada bag, or my mother's fake smile, or the way my dad stared at his beer to avoid my eyes. I didn't have to. He smelled the emotional cordite on me the second I walked into the building. He knew I had been in a firefight. Liam reached out. He didn't touch my left side. He knew exactly where the armor was cracked. He rested the rough knuckles of his right hand lightly against my uninjured right shoulder. The physical weight of it anchored me to the floor. You don't need to wear your armor when you're standing next to me, he said. I closed my eyes. The rigid steel rod holding my spine together suddenly bent. Just a little. My lungs expanded, pushing against my ribs. I pulled in a long, ragged breath. It was the first time I'd actually inhaled oxygen in a week. I was safe, here with the people who actually saw me. The blood of the covenant was thicker than the water of the womb, but peace never lasts. From down the hall, muffled inside my locked civilian locker, my personal cell phone started ringing. A shrill, relentless, piercing tone. The real world was trying to break the door down. Wednesday, 1300 hours. I pushed open the heavy steel door of the satellite imaging room. The thick latch clicked shut behind me, sealing away the glowing tactical maps and the dull hum of the cooling servers. The corridor of the E-ring was completely empty. The air out here felt dead, smelling faintly of industrial bleach and old floor wax. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the stiff edge of the medical tape pulling tight against my skin. Deep in the left pocket of my tactical trousers, my civilian cell phone started to vibrate. It wasn't the encrypted government line. It was the cheap plastic anchor tying me to Virginia. I leaned my back against the cold concrete wall. I pulled the phone out. The screen glared under the harsh fluorescent lights. One word on the caller ID. Mom. I hadn't heard a single word from her since I walked out the front door into the freezing wind last week. No text asking if I got home safe. No call to check on me. Nothing. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. No, hello. No basic human greeting. Her voice came through the cheap speaker, shrill, tight, and loaded with rehearsed ammunition. Alicia, why do you always have to do this? I closed my eyes. I focused on the low grinding hum of the Pentagon's ventilation system droning above me. Do what exactly? I asked. My voice was completely flat. The dinner you made your sister cry all night. Did you know that she was locked in the bathroom sobbing and you just stormed off like a moody teenager? I stared at a black scuff mark on the opposite wall. I didn't storm off. I asked her a single question. Then I walked out the door instead of wasting my breath on a fight. A heavy theatrical sigh blasted through the receiver. It was the exact same sigh she used to suffocate any logic in that house. The ultimate weapon of suburban damage control. Oh, please. Mom snapped, her tone shifting into that condescending, patronizing rhythm. You know exactly how she gets. Richard is out on deployment. She's under a massive amount of stress right now. She just wanted to feel special for one night. To show off a little bit. Is that really a crime? She didn't wait for an answer. She just kept pushing the bulldozer forward. You are the older sister. Your job? Well, you sit at a desk all day. You have it easy, Alicia. You are not out there on a ship. Why couldn't you just let her have her moment? Why do you always have to make everything a big production? You embarrassed her. My stomach turned. A cold, hard knot of physical nausea twisted deep in my gut. The bile rose in the back of my throat. I sit at a desk all day. I just spent the last 6 hours calculating the blast radius of surface-to-air missiles. I just mapped a hostile coastline so her precious son-in-law wouldn't sail his fleet into a slaughterhouse. My shoulder was currently bleeding through a fresh bandage from a combat injury she didn't even know existed. And she thought I had it easy. She thought my silence was a production. She mistook my quiet for surrender. She dropped her voice, slipping into the role of the benevolent peacemaker. Listen to me, she cooed. Come over this Sunday. We will do an early dinner. I will make that herb-roasted chicken you like, with the red potatoes. Just come over, give Chloe a hug, and apologize. Tell her you were out of line. Family is everything, Alicia. You just need to be the bigger person. I stopped leaning against the wall. I stood up straight, my boots planted firm on the floor. She was bartering my dignity for a dead bird and some roasted potatoes. The delusion was absolute. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted a sponge, a human shock absorber, someone to soak up Chloe's toxic, narcissistic garbage so she wouldn't have to deal with the screaming herself. If I apologized, the boat stopped rocking. Her perfect fake family portrait stayed intact. The nausea faded out. It vanished, replaced by a wave of cold, calculated disgust. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a fraction of a second. Far away outside the thick walls of the base, a test siren wailed. I brought the phone back to my mouth. Mom, listen to me, I said. The words came out like cut steel. I am making the chicken, Alicia, so I am not coming to dinner. The line went dead quiet for 1 second. Alicia, do not do this to me. Her voice cracked, ramping up for the guilt trip. The classic wail about disrespect and ungrateful children. I cut her off. Hard. And I am never going to apologize for refusing to be a trash can for Chloe's fragile ego. Excuse me, she shrieked. How dare you speak to your mother like... I didn't let her finish the sentence. I slammed my thumb down on the red icon. Click. The screen went black. The voice was gone. The sudden silence in the hallway was heavy and absolute. I didn't put the phone back in my pocket. I kept it in my right hand. I squeezed the edges. The muscles in my forearm pulled tight, the veins standing up against the skin. I squeezed harder. The hard plastic casing dug brutally into my palm. My knuckles turned stark white. I squeezed until the joints in my fingers throbbed with a dull ache, until a sharp, distinct crack echoed in the empty corridor. A jagged spiderweb fracture split right down the center of the tempered glass screen. My thumb traced the jagged fracture in the tempered glass. The phone was still in my hand. The hallway was dead quiet, save for the dull, heavy drone of the Pentagon's air handlers. My pulse hammered against my temples, a steady, rhythmic thud. Like a distant artillery strike, I didn't put the phone away in my pocket. I unlocked it. The broken screen flickered, glitching slightly under my thumb, but the touch screen still worked. I opened my messages. I scrolled past the encrypted work channels, past Liam's brief check-ins, down to a massive group thread I hadn't voluntarily opened in 10 years. The Barker family group chat. A digital graveyard of fake suburban perfection. 10 years of mom posting pictures of her dry, overcooked casseroles. 10 years of dad sending thumbs-up emojis just to avoid actual conversations. 10 years of Chloe demanding constant attention for a new leather purse, a new beach vacation, a new reason she was fundamentally better than everyone else. And 10 years of my absolute suffocating silence. I was the ghost in the chat. The designated punching bag who only read the messages but never ever fought back. Not today. I tapped the text box. The sharp, splintered edges of the broken glass bit into the pad of my thumb. I didn't care. I typed. My fingers moved with the cold, mechanical precision of a strike coordinator locking in hostile coordinates. I didn't backspace. I didn't second guess. I didn't delete a single character. This wasn't a frantic emotional rant. This was a calculated execution. Cold anger. The kind of anger that freezes your veins and sharpens your vision until everything is crystal clear. I typed the verdict. To Mom, Dad, and Chloe. I will never apologize for defending my own dignity. This family's endless tolerance for Chloe's arrogance ends right here today. Do not contact me again until you figure out how to respect me as a human being instead of treating me like a tool to feed your fragile egos. I stared at the block of text. No exclamation points. No angry emojis, just cold, hard steel. I hit send. The green bubble appeared on the cracked screen. Delivered. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall, the rough texture catching the heavy fabric of my uniform. I watched the screen. I gave them exactly 10 seconds. I knew their routine. I knew the exact psychological sequence of a toxic system losing control of its favorite target. 3 seconds passed. Nothing. 5 seconds. They were reading it. The shock was setting in. 7 seconds. The delusion was cracking open. At exactly 10 seconds, the broken screen lit up like a Christmas tree. 3 gray typing bubbles appeared simultaneously. Chloe was typing. Dad was typing. A missed call notification flashed at the top of the screen from my older brother, Kevin. The flying monkeys were being deployed. They were panicking. The invisible ghost they had stepped on for nearly 40 years just grew fangs and bit back. They were scrambling desperately, trying to bombard me with messages to scream at me, to force me back into the tiny box they built for me. Back into my designated role as the family failure. Have you ever reached that ultimate breaking point? That exact moment where you stopped caring about keeping the peace and finally chose to protect yourself? If you have ever hit the block button on a toxic family member to save your own sanity, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe right now. Drop a comment below and just type the word done. Let me know you understand this exact feeling. I'm reading every single one. My phone vibrated violently in my hand. A relentless buzzing swarm of incoming attacks. Kevin calling again. Chloe sending a massive, unbroken paragraph of aggressive text. Mom calling. I didn't read a single word of Chloe's message. I didn't answer a single call. I pressed and held the power button on the side of the device. The screen blurred, bringing up the power menu. The digital slider appeared. Slide to power off. I dragged my thumb heavily across the broken glass. The red bar followed my finger. The screen dimmed. The Apple logo appeared for a fraction of a second, glowing faintly in the dim hallway, before fading into total, absolute blackness. The vibration stopped. The noise stopped. The Barker family ceased to exist in my reality. I walked over to my secure civilian locker just outside the SCIF entrance. I pulled open the heavy metal drawer. I tossed the clinically dead phone inside. It hit the metal bottom with a hollow clatter. I slammed the drawer shut. The heavy steel lock engaged with a loud final click. It sounded exactly like a coffin nailing shut. I turned my back on the locker. I stepped up to the massive copper-lined vault door of the tactical room. The armed guard swiped my red badge. The heavy bolts retracted with a mechanical grind. I walked in, sat down in my worn leather command chair, and swiveled 180 degrees. The massive Department of Defense tactical screens flared to life, casting a harsh, neon green glow across my face. The old Alicia Barker, the quiet sister, the convenient punching bag, the suburban disappointment, was dead. She died out in that hallway. I placed my hands on the keyboard. Only Phantom 6 remained. Day 12. 0900 hours. The strategic operations room felt like a concrete submarine, 2 stories below ground, no windows. Just the endless suffocating hum of server racks and the faint smell of ozone from the heavy electronics. The air was always freezing. It kept the machines running fast and the operators awake. Colonel Hayes didn't bother using the intercom. He pushed through the heavy blast door, his combat boots scuffing the polished floor. He walked straight past the junior analysts and stopped dead at my glass console. He didn't offer a greeting. He just raised his right hand and slammed a thick red manila folder onto the glass. Smack. The heavy plastic, tamper-evident seal around it crinkled. The file smelled like fresh laser printer ink and hot plastic. Navy is rotating a carrier group in to support the outer perimeter. Hayes set his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He leaned his heavy knuckles on my desk. They're going to set up a hard blockade line off the coast. You are running point with their task force commander. Hayes pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the red cover. Remember, Phantom, you are the final word. You hold the ultimate coordination authority. Do not let those boat drivers push you around. He tapped the folder twice and walked away, disappearing back into the corridor. I didn't move immediately. I let the silence settle back into the room. Then I reached out and dragged the heavy folder across the glass. The plastic seal felt cheap and rigid under my fingertips. I dug my thumbnail into the seam and ripped it open. I flipped the stiff cardstock cover back. Page 1. An 8x10 glossy service portrait. It was a blindingly white navy dress uniform. The collar was perfectly stiff. The chest was stacked with rows of shiny, polished diplomatic ribbons and foreign liaison medals. Medals that had probably never seen a single speck of actual combat dirt. Above the uniform was a perfectly groomed haircut and a smug, impossibly arrogant jawline. The bold black text printed dead center beneath the photo burned into my retinas. Admiral Richard Sterling. For the first time in a month, a cold electric shock fired up the base of my spine. It shot straight into the back of my skull, making the hairs on my arms stand up. My lungs stopped, just for a fraction of a second. Richard, my brother-in-law. The same guy who sat at the head of my parents' dining table 2 weeks ago, swirling a glass of top-shelf bourbon. The guy who flashed that condescending country club smile while his wife publicly trashed my career. He had looked at me like I was a low-level secretary, a paper pusher, someone who existed merely to process his travel vouchers. He didn't just stumble into my crosshairs. The prey had actively kicked down the door to the slaughterhouse and demanded a front-row seat. I didn't smile. I didn't laugh or pump my fist. That kind of emotional garbage gets you killed in this room. The hunter instinct took over. Pure mechanical predatory focus. I reached into the breast pocket of my tactical shirt and pulled out my heavy brass fountain pen. I popped the cap off. Click. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. I pressed the steel nib against the thick paper, dragging a hard black ink line directly under his operational history. I scanned his stats. I read his command structure. I checked his security profile. Security clearance level 3. I slowly looked up from the paper. I stared at the neon green numbers glowing at the top right corner of my primary command monitor. My security clearance level 5. Level 3 meant he was cleared to execute orders on the water. Level 5 meant I was the one writing those orders in blood. He was a glorified traffic cop. I owned the entire highway. Richard was going to strut into the Joint Operations briefing room tomorrow morning. He was going to walk through those doors with that same arrogant, white-collar swagger he used to intimidate my weak-willed father. He fully expected to bark orders at a room full of anonymous special ops grunts. He thought he was coming to teach a masterclass in naval superiority. He had absolutely no idea the room he was walking into was already a concrete graveyard for his ego. I swiveled my heavy leather chair toward the encrypted terminal. I opened the Joint Task Force personnel grid. A blinking white cursor waited in the dark, empty void of the screen. I typed in his military identification number. The mechanical keyboard clacked violently, like dry bones snapping. The screen buffered. A gray dialog box popped up over the map. Admiral R. Sterling. Status pending authorization. He needed a leash. And I was going to be the phantom holding the heavy steel chain. I placed my fingers back over the keys. I didn't hesitate. I typed a continuous top-secret command string into the terminal. I systematically stripped his autonomous field command. I routed every single one of his tactical decisions, every strike order, every ship movement directly under my central radio supervision. He wouldn't be able to sneeze on the bridge of his own ship without asking my permission first. The system locked the input. It prompted the final verification screen. It needed an executive digital signature to make the override legal and binding across the entire Department of Defense. I typed the letters slowly. PHANTOM6. I stared at the heavy enter key. I thought about the Prada bag sitting on my combat jacket. I thought about the smirk on his face when Chloe called me a desk clerk. I slammed my finger down on the key. The screen flashed bright green. Authorization locked. Chain of command updated. The steel jaws of the trap snapped shut with a deafening digital finality. No politician, no naval board, no amount of screaming could save him now. He belonged to me. I capped my pen with a sharp, satisfying click. A slow smirk finally crept across my face in the dark. See you soon, Admiral. Exactly 2 weeks since the birthday dinner. 0900 hours. I sat at the head of a massive U-shaped glass table deep inside the SCIF. The room was a concrete icebox. The only sound was the low, heavy drone of the server banks, processing millions of data points a second. The air tasted like copper and old coffee. I kept my hands folded flat on the glass. To my right, a bank of black and white security monitors displayed the outer corridor. I watched him walk, Admiral Richard Sterling. He strode down the E-ring hallway like he owned the concrete under his boots. He wore his crisp, blindingly white navy dress uniform, gold bars on his shoulders, rows of colorful ribbons pinned to his chest. He threw a dismissive, arrogant nod at the 2 heavily armed guards flanking the vault door. He didn't see them as men holding loaded rifles. He saw them as the hired help. His chest was puffed out. His chin was tipped up. He was a guy used to walking into boardrooms and having people kiss his ring. He thought he was coming down here to educate a bunch of nameless grunts on how a real fleet operates. The heavy steel door groaned on its massive hinges. Richard stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the dead air of the hallway. The electronic deadbolt engaged with a loud metallic shriek. He walked straight into the bright, harsh glare of the center lights. He paused near the middle of the table. A smug, polished smile started to form on his face. He reached up with his right hand, casually unbuttoning the top button of his suit jacket to get comfortable. He opened his mouth, drawing in a breath to deliver whatever arrogant, folksy greeting he had rehearsed in the mirror that morning. He didn't get the chance. A senior intelligence officer standing by the main tactical screen cut him off. He slapped a heavy metal pointer against the glass display. Navy element, the officer barked, his voice flat and bored. Meet your strike coordination commander. Call sign Phantom 6. I sat dead center in the shadows at the head of the table. I didn't say a word. I just slowly tilted my head up. The overhead halogen light cut through the dark. It hit the collar of my tactical shirt. It illuminated the scarred skin on my neck, and it caught the matte black identification plate strapped to my chest. Richard's eyes tracked the movement. They locked onto my face. Time stopped. I watched a man's entire reality disintegrate in real time. The pupils of his eyes shrank down to the size of pinpricks. The smug country club smile literally slid off his face. His jaw unhinged, dropping open as if the muscles had just snapped. For 3 agonizing seconds, his brain completely stalled. A total, catastrophic system failure. He was trying to process the impossible. The quiet, boring sister-in-law. The secretary who got bullied out of her own chair for a leather purse. The woman he had mocked over a cheap buttercream cake. She was sitting in the apex predator seat of the most secure bunker on the East Coast. Not a single sound came out of his mouth. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white against his stiff uniform collar. A thick bead of cold sweat broke out on his right temple, catching the glare of the monitors. His hand was still hovering mid-air over his jacket button. It started to shake. A fine, uncontrollable tremor. He slowly lowered his hand. He swallowed hard. The sound of his dry throat clicking echoed in the dead silence of the room. He realized it right then. Every single joke, every passive-aggressive insult he allowed at that dinner table. It had just signed a death warrant for his career. I didn't smile. I didn't lean back and gloat. I didn't offer him a single ounce of human emotion. I just stared at him with the dead blank eyes of a sniper looking through a scope. I reached out and pressed the heavy silver button on the base of my desk microphone. "Admiral Sterling," I said. My voice was flat, cold, a sheet of black ice. He flinched, a genuine physical flinch. "Your forces will establish a hard blockade line at coordinate 42 north." I commanded the audio feeding directly into the room's speakers. "You will not authorize live fire until I drop the target mark. Is that clear?" His spine collapsed. The arrogant posture, the puffed-out chest, the white-collar superiority, it all crumpled into dust. Muscle memory took over his panicked brain. His heavy black boots scraped against the floor. His heels slammed together in a rigid, desperate reflex. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. His voice was a pathetic, raspy croak. The invisible slap was deafening. It tore his ego down to the studs. 40 minutes later, the briefing ended. The other officers packed up their encrypted tablets and filed out of the room. Richard didn't move. He stood frozen by his chair, his pristine white uniform damp with sweat under the arms. He waited until the heavy steel door closed behind the last officer. He looked like a cornered rat. He took a shaky step toward my desk. His hands were still trembling. "Alicia," he whispered, his voice cracking. He looked around the empty room like the walls were closing in. Does Chloe know about this?" I didn't look up at him. I picked up my brass fountain pen from the glass desk. I slid the heavy metal cap on. Click. "That is your problem, Admiral," I said to the empty air. "Do not bring your family garbage into this room." 3 days later. 2100 hours. Someone hammered on my apartment door, heavy frantic fists hitting the cheap composite wood. The hollow thuds echoed through my living room. I didn't rush. I put down my water glass on the counter. I walked over and flipped the deadbolt. Chloe stood in the dim hallway. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, ugly black streaks. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving under a designer trench coat. She smelled like cheap white wine exhaust fumes and pure, unfiltered panic. She pushed past me, stumbling into my living room. I didn't stop her. I just closed the door and leaned my shoulder against the frame, watching the performance. "Why did you hide it?" She choked out, her voice pitching up into a hysterical whine. "Did you do it on purpose?" "You wanted to make me look like an idiot in front of Richard, didn't you?" Always the victim, always the center of her own tragic manufactured universe. She wasn't here to apologize for 15 years of abuse. She was here to do damage control. I didn't cross the room to comfort her. I didn't offer a tissue. I just stood there, spine-straight, arms resting at my sides. "You're not crying because you love me, Chloe," I said. Flat, zero empathy. You're crying because your husband came home tonight and told you he had to snap his heels and salute the exact same person you've been treating like garbage." She froze. Her mouth fell open, but the excuse died in her throat. The ugly truth hit her right between the eyes. I pointed a finger at the door. "Get out." She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking, and practically ran. I slammed the door shut and locked it. 6 weeks later. Thanksgiving at the Barker house. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey sage stuffing and absolute suffocating hypocrisy. Everything was a complete 180. A theatrical masterpiece of survival. The second I walked into the room, Richard practically jumped out of his seat. He stood at attention, his posture rigid. He grabbed the back of the heavy wooden chair at the head of the table and pulled it out for me. "Here you go, Sister Alicia. Have a seat," he said. "Sister Alicia." I looked at him. He didn't meet my eyes. He stared firmly at the collar of my civilian sweater, terrified I might give an order. Chloe sat across from me. She wore a thick, high-necked wool sweater, hunched over like she was trying to shrink into the upholstery. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't show off her nails. She just stared at her empty plate. Dad hovered around the table. He grabbed a bottle of expensive red wine and poured it into my glass with shaky hands. A massive upgrade from the cheap canned beer he usually drank while completely ignoring my existence. Mom walked out of the kitchen carrying a heavy ceramic serving bowl. Her face was stretched into a tight plastic smile, the kind of forced smile that makes your facial muscles cramp and twitch. "Oh, honey." Mom cooed, piling a massive scoop of mashed potatoes onto my plate. "We are just so incredibly proud of you. I always told your father you were doing big things out there in Washington. Didn't I, Arthur? Chloe is just so proud of her big sister." My stomach rolled. A heavy, sickening knot of physical nausea twisted deep in my gut. It was worse than the insults. It was worse than the Prada bag incident. This sudden groveling respect was vile. They weren't sorry they had abused me. They weren't sorry they let me bleed out financially to save this very house. They were terrified of the rank I wore. They were trying to buy back 15 years of psychological warfare with a plate of dark meat and gravy. I looked down at the food. I didn't pick up my fork. I placed my hands flat on the glass tabletop. I gripped the edges of my heavy ceramic plate and pushed it away. Screech! The rough bottom of the plate dragged across the glass. The ugly grating noise cut straight through Mom's fake, high-pitched chatter like a razor blade. The entire table froze. Dad stopped pouring the wine. Richard stiffened in his chair. I tapped my index finger once against the glass. A single, sharp knock. "Stop doing this," I said. My voice was low. It carried across the table like a cold draft. Mom's plastic smile twitched. "Doing what, sweetie?" "This." I gestured to the wine, the chair, the sudden sickening respect. "Being sorry that you were wrong about my job is not the same thing as being sorry that you were cruel to me. You are praising me today because you are terrified of my clearance level. You aren't sorry for treating me like a disease." Dad cleared his throat loudly. The coward's escape hatch. He reached for his water glass, trying to look anywhere but at me. I ignored him. I locked my eyes directly onto Chloe. She flinched, shrinking further into her oversized sweater. "Let me ask you a question, Chloe," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. If the Department of Defense stripped my rank tomorrow, if I lost my clearance, if I went right back to being the anonymous card-swiping desk clerk you always thought I was. I let the silence hang. I let it suffocate the room. Would you still respect me at this table? Chloe's throat worked. She swallowed hard. She opened her mouth. Her lips parted, but absolutely no sound came out. Her eyes darted to Richard, then down to her lap. Nothing. Just the deafening silence of the rotten truth. They didn't love me. They loved the phantom sitting in the chair. I pushed my chair back. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't overturn the table. I just looked at the three of them frozen in their pathetic, fake little world. I turned around and grabbed my heavy winter coat off the hook by the door. "This dinner isn't for me," I said. I pushed the front door open and walked out into the cold air. 6 months later. The backyard smelled heavily of burning hickory wood and charred beef fat. I stood alone near the edge of the wooden privacy fence, holding a clear plastic cup of ice water. The noise of the barbecue was a low, steady hum behind me. Richard walked across the grass. He was not wearing his pristine white dress uniform. He wore a faded gray cotton shirt and work jeans. He held a sweating glass bottle of beer. He stopped 2 feet in front of me and extended the bottle forward. He used both hands, a deliberate physical gesture of total submission. I was lazy, Richard said, staring blankly at the paper label on the glass. Intellectually lazy. I bought into Chloe's cheap narrative about you because it stroked my own ego. It made me feel superior. I apologize. I took the bottle. The cold glass chilled the palm of my hand. I gave him a single slow nod. Chloe stepped onto the concrete patio. She did not ask about the Pentagon. She did not ask about my clearance level. She walked over, stopped beside her husband, and looked directly at the faded, jagged scar tissue peeking out from the collar of my shirt. "How did you survive that kind of quiet?" Chloe asked. Her voice was incredibly small, stripped entirely of the usual suburban armor. For the first time in 15 years, I spoke the brutal truth. And for the first time in 15 years, they actually kept their mouths shut and listened. 3 years later. The heavy solid oak door of Colonel Hayes's office slammed shut. He slid a thick yellow manila folder across the polished desk. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stock paper, a permanent transfer order to a coastal command base down in Florida, paired directly with a promotion, Lieutenant Colonel. Accepting the metal oak leaf meant leaving Virginia. It meant leaving the fragile, newly rebuilt peace with my parents. It meant leaving Liam behind in the basement of the Pentagon. I met Liam by the industrial coffee machine in the break room. He looked at the sealed envelope in my hand. He did not flinch. He did not offer a selfish excuse to make me stay. He simply reached out, his rough, calloused knuckles gripping my right shoulder, the exact same spot he anchored me years ago. "Sign the paper." Liam said, his voice a low, steady rumble over the noise of the machines. "You were built to command the board. Go take your seat." My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Chloe." I answered it, expecting the classic tearful manipulation, the desperate guilt trip to keep me local. "Take the promotion, Alicia," Chloe said over the line. The background noise of her house was dead quiet. "Do not let us anchor you down. You earned that." The invisible ghost of the old toxic Barker family was officially dead. I pulled my heavy brass fountain pen from my pocket and signed my name on the solid black line. Florida. The coastal wind whipped violently across the asphalt tarmac. The heavy nylon of the American flag snapped like a rifle shot against the steel pole. The bright, blinding sun beat down on my dark dress uniform, trapping the heat against my skin. Colonel Hayes stood squarely in front of me. He pushed the heavy silver oak leaf insignia directly through the thick fabric of my shoulder board. The metal backing clicked sharply into place. The physical weight of the rank pressed down hard against my collarbone. I did not look back into the crowd of spectators for validation. I did not need their permission to feel proud. The ceremony broke formation. Chloe walked up to me on the hot asphalt. She did not offer a fake, polite handshake. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a tight, desperate hug. "I am sorry," Chloe whispered directly into my shoulder, her voice shaking. "I am so sorry I needed you to be small, just so I could feel big." She pulled away, wiping her eyes. Richard stepped up right behind her. He squared his broad shoulders. He brought his right hand up in a rapid, fluid motion. The side of his palm struck the edge of his brow. A perfectly executed, razor-sharp military salute. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel," Richard said. His voice was firm, completely hollowed out of its old arrogance. "Your absolute boundaries completely broke my pride." I raised my hand and returned the salute, a silent, mutual understanding. The war was over. The reception eventually ended. I walked out to the empty parking lot alone. My heavy black combat boots crunched against the loose gravel and the sun-baked asphalt. I unlocked my truck and pulled the heavy steel door open. I paused. I looked up into the side mirror. The Florida sunset bled across the reflective glass in deep, violent streaks of red and orange. Being a phantom on the battlefield is a tactical requirement. Staying entirely invisible keeps your people alive. But making yourself invisible in your own daily life, allowing blood relatives to step on your spine just to keep the peace at a dinner table, that is a slow, quiet suicide. I am Lieutenant Colonel Alicia Barker. I control the airspace. I hold the absolute line. And I completely refuse to ever shrink myself down to fit into someone else's comfortable little box again. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, or if this story gave you the raw strength to finally stand up for yourself, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Drop a comment below and type the words, "I am ready," if you are finally prepared to draw your own absolute boundaries. I read every single one. Do not stay a ghost in your own life.